My wife's brother and his twins destroyed our home and my daughter's mental health. Now, they're out, and we're rebuilding the piece they shattered. My brother-in-law and his 18-year-old twin daughters live with us, and the twins have absolutely no respect for my daughter's privacy. The day they moved in, they walked into my daughter's room and took her clothes. They only gave them back after I pressured them to, and when I brought this to my brother-in-law, he saw no problem with it. My wife said the same, that this was just teenage girl behavior. The twins soon became more invasive, taking my daughter's jewelry, skincare products, and even her laptop. The last straw came when my daughter bought a $75 makeup kit that she saved up for, and one of the girls took it without permission and ruined it. When I heard this, I was irate, and immediately got my daughter an industrial-sized padlock for her room. When my brother-in-law saw the lock, he wasn't happy. He yelled that I'm treating his daughters like thieves, and that my spoiled brat could just buy a $10 makeup kit from Walmart. As soon as he said this, I wanted to lunge at him, but my wife walked in and interrupted us. She ended up taking his side, saying teenage girls borrow each other's stuff all the time, and I should remove the lock from our daughter's door. Over my dead body were my exact words. Well, it should come as no surprise that it wasn't long before the situation went from bad to worse. Despite the lock, my daughter's privacy was still being invaded. The twins somehow found her hidden key, which I told her to keep as a backup in case she lost hers. I still don't know how they did it, and one day, while she was out, they snuck into her room and took her laptop. This time, they left the clothes and the makeup. Hours later, they returned it, but it was practically destroyed. The screen was cracked, the keyboard wasn't responding, and it wouldn't even turn on. When my daughter saw it, she completely broke down. That laptop held everything. Months of college essays, projects she had spent late nights perfecting, and personal photos she couldn't replace. She sat on the floor, holding the broken laptop, and cried uncontrollably. I had never seen her like that before, and my heart shattered. I was beyond furious. This was deliberate, careless, and cruel. I stormed into the living room where my brother-in-law was sitting, totally oblivious to the damage his kids had caused. I told him what happened, expecting some kind of apology, or at least an acknowledgement that his daughters had crossed a line. Instead, he shrugged. He said that they didn't do any harm to my daughter, Courtney, and that this was the reason for having backups of everything. He made it seem like I had to teach her a lesson. I saw red. That accident just wiped out months of my daughter's work. He didn't have any idea what that laptop meant to her. She saved up for it herself, and now it's ruined. I told him that they needed to be held accountable. He said he would talk to the twins, but he said he was sure they didn't do it on purpose. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They've been invading her space for weeks, taking her things, and now they've destroyed something she can't replace. I told him that he needed to fix this, because if he didn't, I would. After a long, heated argument, he finally agreed to cover part of the cost of replacing the laptop. He acted like he was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful he was offering anything at all. It was infuriating. The tension in the house grew even worse after that. My wife tried to stay neutral, and hoped that things would work themselves out if we all just gave it time. But even she was starting to get frustrated. Her brother's attitude and complete lack of responsibility were wearing her down. She defended him less and less, and I could see the strain in her eyes whenever we argued about the situation. The next week, Marcy and I knew we had to take a vacation away from the mess at home. So Marcy, Courtney, and I went on a weekend trip to a nearby resort that had an amusement park nearby. It was so relaxing, and made me almost forget everything that was going on at home. Unfortunately, we had to return home, and as I walked into the house, I froze. The smell of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and something sweet hit me in the face. As I walked in, I noticed spilled soda that had soaked into the carpet. My wife gasped beside me. The living room was a disaster. The couch cushions were on the floor, the coffee table had been pushed against the wall, and muddy shoe prints led straight through to the kitchen. Empty cans, bottles, and wrappers were everywhere, as if a tornado had flown around the room before we came. I felt my stomach turn, but I couldn't waste time there. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. My heart pounded. When I reached my daughter's room, I saw the lock I'd installed was smashed, the door hung slightly open, and there was chaos inside. Her dresser drawers were yanked out, clothes strewn across the floor, her bed unmade, and her laptop was gone. I heard my wife's footsteps behind me, her gasp sharp as she took it all in. "Oh my God," she whispered. She looked at the broken lock, then the mess inside. For a moment, she just stood there, silent. Her hand covered her mouth. She didn't move. Downstairs, the door clicked open, and my brother-in-law strolled in, phone in hand, with a lazy grin on his face. He told us the kids had a bit of a party, and while we were gone, they got carried away. They trashed the place. Her room was destroyed. This is everything to her. He didn't even look up from his phone and told me to relax. He brought up how we threw worse parties when we were kids. Remember that one in high school? Mom and Dad were out of town, and we had the whole crew over. He smiled at the memory like he was proud of it. We wrecked the house, but we cleaned it up. No problem. Mom never found out. Same thing here. No big deal, he said. My wife looked beyond furious. She reminded him that they cleaned up the mess before their parents got home. This was nothing like it was in high school. He then reassured me that the kids would clean it up. He said we were blowing this way out of proportion. For the first time since they moved in, I saw my wife stand up against her brother. My wife took a step forward towards him and told him he was going to clean this up and pay for the damage. The brother looked confused at first. He didn't expect to have to pay for any damages. He tried to reason with her, saying that it was just a party. She cut him off in the middle of his pleas and told him that the twins needed to take responsibility. He stared at her. For a second, he looked like he might argue, but then he swallowed whatever words he had ready. He eventually agreed that he would take care of it, but not without a huge sigh. He wasn't used to being called out like this, especially not by his sister. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, going over the family's finances. Something had been nagging at me for weeks. Our savings seemed lower than expected, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. As I dug deeper into the bank records, I noticed a pattern. There were small recurring withdrawals. Every few days, $50 here, $75 there. Over time, it added up, and my heart sank as I realized the total was well over $1,000. I double-checked everything, hoping I was wrong, but I knew that wasn't the case. The withdrawal patterns didn't match our spending habits, and my wife had been just as careful with our finances as I had. That's when it hit me. There was only one other person with access to our account. I waited until my wife got home and laid the bank records in front of her. I showed her that someone's been siphoning money from our savings. She flipped through the pages. I saw the realization in her eyes. The dates and amounts pointed to one person. It was her brother. He's been taking small amounts for months. I don't know what he's using it for, but it was all there. For a moment, she just stared at the papers as if hoping they would tell her something different. Then she dropped them onto the table. We didn't need to wait long to confront him. When he came in later that night, I didn't hold back. I laid out the records in front of him. And before he could come up with any excuses, my wife demanded an explanation. He immediately admitted to taking the money but told us that it wasn't what we thought. He explained that he'd been struggling, and that he'd been using the money on football picks for this online gambling thing but swore it was almost paid off. He said he just needed a little more time and a couple more $100, and he'd be out of our hair. He promised that he was close to hitting it big. My wife blinked in disbelief. He knew it sounded bad, and explained it was all part of the game. He said he had already made a little under 100, but that's because he was just starting out. He claimed to know how to win now. She went off on him, and he tried to explain that he wasn't stealing from her because he had the intention on giving it back to her. He said he was desperate, and didn't want to live with us forever, and this was going to be his way out to get his own house again. He'd seen it happen for a lot of his buddies and said he wanted to try it out. He begged us to give him a little bit more time and eventually money. She told him that he would have to pay every cent of that money back and didn't care how close he thought he was to winning big. This stops now. You've betrayed us. You've stolen from your own family, and for what? A chance at some quick cash? She yelled at him. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the look on her face. But even as he agreed, I knew things would never be the same. The trust that they once had went out the window after he stole from us. She couldn't even look at him the same way, and at that moment, as I watched her walk away, I realized that something had shifted between them. As the days passed, the tension between them only grew. My wife still tried to maintain some semblance of peace in the house, but the distance between her and her brother was obvious. She no longer defended him or brushed aside his actions with excuses. I got a call while I was at work. My daughter had collapsed at school. The principal said she passed out in the middle of the hallway in between classes. They said it was exhaustion, but when we got to the hospital, it was pretty clear that it was more than that. She was lying in bed, hooked up to monitors, pale and drained. The doctor came in and didn't sugarcoat it. He said it was caused by stress. She was physically and emotionally burned out, and it wasn't school or social stuff. It was home, the constant tension, the fights over her space, and the twins were always messing with her. It had all taken its toll. I glanced over at my wife. I could tell she was in shock, but also realizing how bad things had actually gotten. All those times I'd told her that the situation was too much, that our daughter was suffering, she'd brushed it off. But now, here we were. The guilt on her face was obvious. She didn't say much, but I could tell it hit her hard. I didn't need to say anything. We both knew. Our daughter was in the hospital because of the mess at home. My wife didn't try to justify anything. She just sat there, quiet. After a while, she leaned over and took our daughter's hand. I knew that it was about time. Her brother and his daughters had to go. No more second chances or trying to make it work. Our daughter needed peace, and we couldn't give that to her with them in the house. My wife finally saw it too. After the hospital visit, I knew I couldn't avoid him any longer. Things had spiraled out of control, and the moment I walked back into the house, I realized it was time to face my brother-in-law. I found him sitting in the living room, completely oblivious. That casual attitude he always had used to be harmless, but now it just made my blood boil. I didn't waste any time. I told him he and the girls needed to leave. Enough was enough. At first, he resisted, saying he had nowhere to go, as if that somehow excused everything that had happened. He played the family card and tried to guilt me into changing my mind, but this time I didn't budge. My daughter's well-being was at stake, and I wasn't about to sacrifice that for anyone, not even him. The turning point, though, was when my wife stepped in. She'd been stuck in the middle of this whole thing for so long, constantly defending him, brushing off his behavior. But after seeing our daughter in the hospital, something shifted. She backed me up, finally realizing how much harm had been done. I could see the guilt in her face for not stepping in sooner, but now, she was firm. She told her brother he had to go. He was stunned. I don't think he ever expected her to side with me, but the situation had reached a breaking point. The tension in the room was heavy, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to argue again. But he saw that we were serious. They packed their things and left, and just like that, the house felt quieter. It felt like a weight had been lifted. Once they were gone, my wife apologized. I could see how much it had been eating at her, and how much she had overlooked for the sake of family. She admitted she should have seen the signs earlier, and should have listened when I raised concerns. But at that moment, I wasn't interested in blame. I just wanted to move forward for all of us. Later that evening, we went back to see our daughter in the hospital. She was still weak, but I could see a change in her. When we told her they were gone, she seemed relieved. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. After everything we'd been through, my family finally had a chance to breathe again.